All right, that's me. Oh, and it looks like the slides are not up here on this monitor, just as a heads up, so I will make it happen. All right. I'm going to talk to you about digital public squares. So we're going to take Dave's talk and we're going to zoom in an order of magnitude and get a little bit more specific. So for those of you I haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Beth Goldberg. I head research and development at a Google unit called Jigsaw. We exist to help give people agency over what comes next. That's a new tagline for us. Ask me about it later. But what I'm going to talk about today is something that many of you in this room have been working on for years or decades even, so I'm standing on the shoulders of giants with this talk today. Thank you. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how LLMs can help us reimagine digital public squares, what we're doing with that already, and then my colleague Alex is actually going to pick up the baton from me in a few talks and get a little bit more specific about what we've been building. But today I'm going to talk about digital public squares defined really broadly. These are the spaces where we're having deliberative discourse that we need for our democracies to thrive. This is everything from that family WhatsApp thread to social media platforms to publishers' comment sections to deliberative discursive forums like the ones that some of you in this room have created. So a few key takeaways. I don't need to talk about polarization to this room, but I will just start with the premise that the dysfunctional public squares that we have today are a design choice. And there's a little seed of optimism in that dysfunction, which is that if we designed our way into this mess, we can also design our way out of it. The second is that large language models really have afforded us a whole bunch of new opportunities for how we can redesign those spaces, how we can help elevate common ground. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those new opportunities. And then I'll end with this call for us to really trust one another and to build trust as a prerequisite. And that means doing things like building meaningful transparency, not performative transparency, and co-designing with effective communities. So it's not just those of us in this room that think that our public squares are a problem. When we went and talked to about 2,000 Americans, we learned that the status quo isn't working for them either. What we heard from this survey was that people actually want to have common ground and dialogue with one another. They're interested in being able to express their opinions without expecting to get a flame war going. And they actually want to have sort of respectful conversations. But instead, I don't need to tell all of you who are very online that what people find is, they're getting cursed out, there's hostile and judgmental language, and there's sort of these binary right and wrong conversations. So this is leading to many of us, myself included, becoming lurkers online, removing ourselves from those really essential democratic discursive spaces. A scholar that I really appreciate at Duke named Chris Bale has written about this phenomenon and called it the social media prism, right? Conversations come into these discursive spaces and then they get sort of fragmented and distorted as though going through a prism where we're amplifying the extremes, right? We're elevating the loudest voices, the most toxic voices, and you're losing all of that light in the middle, which is our middle majority. And so why that matters to this conversation is when you look at data from over 1,000 public deliberations from Tallahassee to Taiwan, what facilitators have found is that middle majority, those folks who are in the middle of this prism here, is where you can find common ground and paths forward. That's where you can find policy solutions. So this middle is actually where we have the keys to reformulating our digital public squares to be less divisive and more democratic. So if this is suboptimal, how might we actually redesign our public squares to look less like a prism and, if you excuse the dad pun, a little more like a square? So where I'm going to go next is one potential remedy for this, and there are many, but we've been looking at ways to use LLMs to expand conversations at scale, expanding both the participation and the ability to actually make sense of that conversation. So we're first going to go on a little imagination trip here. So imagine that you are asked to collect public input for a new city city policy on climate change. Let's say you're part of the city council. You've got a tight timeline and a limited budget. You would ideally get the input from the hundreds or even thousands of folks in your community to discuss how they feel about the city's allocation of resources on everything from buses and transit to water rights. And and you'd like to keep it constructive. You have a few tools at your disposal. You could have sort of a town hall style event here where you get people to come together and talk. But you know that only a fraction of the community would turn up, and it would be that same fraction that you've heard from a number of times already. You could commission an expensive third-party poll, but you know that this is just a snapshot of opinions and not actually a discussion. You could hold a referendum or some other sort of large-scale vote, but you know that that only happens once every few years and takes enormous resources to marshal. And lastly, you could host a citizen assembly, and this is probably the best solution that you've got in your toolkit right now to really get at nuanced policy questions like climate change, but it requires significant time and resources at the moment to stand up. So what if you could quickly get the pulse of what your community thinks and even foster constructive dialogue and deliberation on these ideas, and then make sense of that conversation at scale? What if you could actually have nuance around everyone's individual viewpoints and not just distill them into sort of a homogeneous slush, and actually then take that meaningful deliberation and give it to decision makers and back to the participants themselves to understand what the community thinks? Well, some folks, the top there says, the simple but ingenious system that Taiwan uses to crowdsource its laws. This is an article from a few years ago that some of you might be familiar with. Back in 2014, some very forward-thinking public officials and technologists in Taiwan did a variation on a theme of what I just described. They used a tool aptly named Polis, one of the co-founders of which is in this room. Thank you, Colin. And they took these public deliberations on really thorny questions like, should we allow Uber in Taiwan? What do we do about Airbnbs? And they brought it to the public. And they had iterative conversations that were deliberative and difficult, but ultimately constructive. And so now, a decade later, we can build on what they've started there and what a number of you have done in that preceding decade to actually make a lot of improvements on this process and make it more efficient and make it much lower resource intensive to pull off. So one of the reasons that we haven't seen a hockey stick style growth since 2014 in Taiwan of these types of deliberations is they have a lot of steps. They're actually pretty complicated affairs to pull off. And so I know this is tiny font, but I wanted to just show you the complexity that is a deliberative process. And to say that every one of these has both human processes and potential AI-enabled processes. We go into a lot more detail in this paper that I've got the QR code for up here. And this diagram comes from that paper that I got to collaboratively write with 27 co-authors across media, academia, civil society, and tech. Some of you are in this room. Thank you co-authors. And what we call out is that, yes, the AI can enhance so many different parts of this deliberative process to make it more accessible, more participatory, and easier ultimately for you as that city council member to pull off in your community. So at Jigsaw, we've been looking at 3 specific capacities where LLMs might facilitate this democratic discourse within that whole flowchart I just showed you. And the first is about scaling inclusively. So for deliberations, we know that LLMs can do basic things to bring more people into a conversation, like translating across languages, making things more accessible for those with accessibility needs. But they can also just allow us to scale in an unprecedented way. And it's parsing and summarizing, that's part of it, but it also allows us to visualize things, it allows us to have iterations, and it allows us to have much more robust conversations where people are able to engage just from their phones. The second is that we know anytime you bring large groups of people together, you're going to have a few troublemakers and trolls. And so what large language models allow us to do is actually have more nuanced moderation at scale, where you can just have plain English prompts to tune your moderation tooling. And lastly, and maybe the part that I'm personally most excited about and that Alex will tell you about in a few minutes, is that we're able to use large language models to identify where there is common ground, shared ideas, and nuanced disagreement across different opinion groups on different topics. So we can start to elevate areas that are maybe lower hanging fruit for a decision maker to go after, and areas where maybe they need to have follow-up conversations. I'll end by just saying all of this only works if there's trust. If our invitations to the public to come debate on our shiny but opaque new tech solutions only come from a few institutions that have lost trust, why would anyone participate? We know that we need to show people how these tools work. We need to sort of demystify some of the AI magic. We need to explore community governance and tuning. And we need to build with and co-design with those affected communities. We know that we can do this. I think places like Polis are a wonderful example of how to have these deliberative conversations at scale. But let's start to call in the middle majority, find out their common ground, and build it together. Thank you.